James Lancaster was a name that echoed in the halls of universities, at rallies, and across social media platforms. A revered anti-racism speaker, he had made a name for himself as a tireless advocate for equality. His speeches were impassioned, his words carefully chosen to resonate with the ideals of justice, peace, and unity. He was a beacon for those fighting against racial inequality, a face of the movement in a world desperate for change. His mission was clear: end racism, empower minorities, and challenge the systemic structures that upheld oppression. Every week, his social media accounts were flooded with posts that championed inclusivity, equality, and the urgency of racial justice. He organized online events, led discussions, and shared powerful articles about racial disparities, police brutality, and the importance of intersectionality. His following grew by the day. James wasn't just an advocate, he was a leader. People looked up to him. His message was simple, yet profound: stand up for the marginalized, fight for justice, and never stay silent in the face of hate. But behind the polished image of the public figure stood a different reality, a reality that few people knew. Away from the cameras, the university halls, and the public eye, James Lancaster was not the same man. He was a man who found comfort in private spaces where no one could judge him. In these moments, the carefully crafted mask of an anti-racism advocate began to slip. When the cameras were off, James engaged in conversations that made his followers cringe. Casual slurs, offensive jokes, racially charged words slipped from his mouth like a second language, language that contradicted everything he had fought for in his public life. It wasn't an isolated incident. Over time, these private conversations became more frequent, more revealing. His friends, colleagues, and family, who had long admired him for his advocacy, were unaware of the man behind the cause. His online presence was a stark contrast to the person he truly was behind closed doors. But those close to him were starting to notice subtle inconsistencies, small, offhand remarks that felt out of place for someone so passionate about fighting for racial equality. What James didn't realize was that his online persona was starting to outgrow his private self. His followers expected him to embody the very ideals he preached, but the cracks in his character were beginning to show. And, like all things hidden in the shadows, the truth had a way of catching up with him. In this complex dichotomy, James Lancaster had become a figure of contradictions, a champion for the oppressed, yet a man who whispered racial slurs when he thought no one was listening. His past was filled with moments of hypocrisy, but it wasn't until the world began to demand more from him that the tension between his public and private selves would explode into something far bigger than he had ever imagined. The world of James Lancaster, the carefully curated image of a moral crusader, began to unravel when a recording surfaced, sending shockwaves through the very communities he had worked so hard to build. It was an ordinary afternoon when the anonymous account posted the audio file to a fringe social media platform. At first, the public brushed it off as a hoax, a scandalous attempt to discredit a prominent figure. But as the file spread, its authenticity became impossible to ignore. The recording was clear and damning: James, in a private conversation with an old friend, casually dropping racial slurs. The words were unapologetic, indifferent, as if they were part of his regular vocabulary. Within hours, the recording was picked up by gossip websites, then by larger media outlets. At first, the internet was divided. Supporters of James rallied to his defense, calling the recording a fabrication. They argued it could have been edited, altered, manipulated, an attempt to destroy a man who had become a symbol of social justice. "This is just another attack on a vocal advocate for change," some of his fans cried. Others suggested that the timing was too coincidental. Wasn't this an election year? Wasn't there an agenda at play? But as the rumors about James's behavior started to surface more frequently, it became harder to dismiss the accusations as mere slander. His critics began digging deeper. A former colleague, someone who had worked closely with James on several campaigns, came forward with stories of his own, stories of inappropriate comments, private racist jokes, and slights that were never made public. The revelation of these similar experiences only fueled the fire, providing weight to the argument that perhaps the man on the recording wasn't an isolated incident, but a reflection of a larger, more troubling pattern of hypocrisy. As the media storm intensified, the supporters of James Lancaster were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The man who had so boldly spoken out against racism, whose words had inspired thousands, had been living a double life. His words in the public sphere and his behavior in private were miles apart. The man who had publicly scorned racism was now under intense scrutiny for perpetuating it in his personal life. This contrast, the public advocate for equality versus the private man who used slurs and made derogatory jokes, created an emotional rift within the communities that once held him in high regard. The betrayal hit hard. Many of James's closest allies felt blindsided, their faith in him shattered. His public persona as the moral compass of the anti-racism movement had been torn apart in a matter of hours. The weight of the hypocrisy became more than just a personal failure for James, it was a blow to the entire movement he had worked to shape. The very ideals he had claimed to uphold were now under intense scrutiny. For those who had supported James, the sense of disillusionment was palpable. How could someone so outspoken about fighting for the oppressed turn out to be so casually indifferent to the very people he claimed to protect? The tension between James's public persona and his private actions was no longer a secret, it was now an open wound, exposed for all to see. And as the story unfolded, it became clear that the damage was far from over. The truth had been set loose, and there would be no easy way to put it back. The fallout from the recording was swift and devastating. What had once been a carefully crafted persona of moral integrity and activism now lay in tatters, as the media storm grew louder with each passing hour. The story dominated headlines for weeks, and James Lancaster's name was synonymous with hypocrisy. News outlets dissected every detail of the audio recording, analyzing his words, his tone, and the context in which they were spoken. But there was no denying what was in front of everyone: a man who had spent years preaching about justice and equality, now exposed for using racist slurs in private. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Social media exploded in outrage, with hashtags like #JamesLancasterExposed and #Hypocrite trending worldwide. People who had once looked up to him as a role model were now torn between anger and disbelief. How could someone who had built his career around anti-racism suddenly be revealed as someone who harbored such contempt behind closed doors? His supporters struggled to reconcile the man they admired with the person they now saw in the recording. The emotional toll was profound. Many felt betrayed, not just by James, but by their own blind trust in his message. Protests erupted outside his public appearances, calling for him to step down from the organizations he represented. Several influential social justice groups and nonprofits, who had once celebrated his work, issued swift condemnations. "We cannot stand by a person who, in his private life, perpetuates the very hate he publicly claims to oppose," read one statement from a prominent anti-racism organization. Calls for James to resign from his speaking engagements, writing opportunities, and even board positions were relentless. The very foundations of his public life began to crumble. Meanwhile, the companies and brands that had partnered with James were quick to sever ties. Corporate sponsors that had once proudly touted their association with the anti-racism advocate now scrambled to distance themselves. "We do not condone the use of racial slurs or any form of hate speech," one sponsor's statement read, followed by a mention of how they were reassessing their relationships with individuals and organizations. James's once lucrative partnerships were now slipping through his fingers, as the corporate world moved quickly to avoid any association with him. As the media frenzy intensified, James finally made a public attempt at damage control. He appeared on a nationally televised interview, looking every bit the man who had once stood at the forefront of the fight for racial justice. His face was tense, his eyes tired, but he was ready to speak. "I deeply regret my words," he began, his voice strained. "Those were private moments, moments I'm not proud of." The recording was taken out of context. "It doesn't reflect who I truly am." But as he spoke, something was missing. His apology felt rehearsed, hollow. He seemed to be more concerned with saving his career than confronting the gravity of his actions. He continued to downplay the situation, insisting that the recording didn't capture the full context of the conversation, an excuse that only further alienated his critics. To many, it became clear that James didn't fully understand the impact of his words. His attempt at an apology seemed to miss the point entirely. It wasn't about context, it was about the hypocrisy of his actions and the betrayal of those who believed in him. The media storm continued to escalate. Memes mocking his apology flooded social media. Supporters began to turn on him, accusing him of perpetuating the very systems of oppression he had claimed to fight. His fall from grace wasn't just a personal loss, it was a devastating blow to the anti-racism movement he had helped shape. The man who once championed justice was now the face of betrayal, and the public seemed unwilling to forgive. The complexity of James's fall from grace had become undeniable. His hypocrisy had fractured the trust of an entire movement, and the chaos of public shaming left him in a precarious position, struggling to reclaim any sense of dignity or respect. James sat alone in the dim light of his study, his gaze fixed on the empty space in front of him. The fallout from the scandal had shattered more than just his career, it had cracked the very foundation of his self-perception. The public outcry, the social media blitz, the sponsors pulling out, it was all consuming. But it was the silence that followed the storm that was the hardest to bear. No more public rallies, no more speaking engagements. No more adoration from the people who once looked up to him as their champion. The applause had stopped, replaced by the deafening sound of his own guilt. For weeks, he had been dodging phone calls, avoiding meetings, and retreating into his own mind. The man who had once been a leader, a voice for the marginalized, now found himself at the mercy of his own contradictions. Every time he closed his eyes, the weight of what he had done seemed to crush him further. The recording was a reminder of his hypocrisy, a glaring truth he could no longer escape. His carefully constructed image of a compassionate, progressive figure had unraveled, exposing the raw, uncomfortable truth beneath. It wasn't just about the recording anymore. It was the realization that, for years, he had been living a lie, saying one thing to the world, while thinking and acting in ways that contradicted those very beliefs. The private James, the man who used slurs and joked about race, had always been there. He had just been hidden behind the public figure, the advocate for change, the face of justice. But now, that private side was out in the open, and there was no way to ignore it. Naomi Garcia, his closest friend and confidant, had been one of the first to reach out to him after the scandal broke. At first, she had been supportive, standing by him as he tried to explain away his actions. But as the weeks passed and James continued to deflect and downplay the gravity of his behavior, Naomi's patience wore thin. She had always believed in the work they were doing together, but now, the cracks in their relationship were impossible to ignore. "James, this isn't just about a bad mistake," Naomi said during one of their tense conversations, her voice a mix of frustration and concern. "This is about who you are. You can't just apologize and expect everything to go back to normal. People are hurt by what you said, and you need to own up to it. Not with excuses, but with real accountability." James had no response at first. He knew Naomi was right. He could no longer hide behind his apologies or public statements. The weight of his actions had settled in, and it was clear, true redemption wouldn't come from words alone. It would require deep, painful reflection. It would require change. And that change had to start with him. Over the following days, James reached out to those he had hurt, minority groups he had worked with, colleagues who had once been his allies, and even his own family. Each conversation was an exercise in humility. He had to face the hurt in their voices, the disappointment in their eyes, and the recognition that he had failed them. There were no easy fixes, no quick ways to erase the damage. With every apology, James felt a piece of his former self slip away. He was no longer the man who spoke on stages, who wore his anti-racism advocacy like a badge of honor. Now, he was someone who had to face the ugly reality of his own failings. He could no longer pretend that his actions didn't have consequences. Naomi didn't let him off easy. "This isn't about getting a free pass, James," she reminded him. "It's about proving that you've learned something. That you've changed. You can't be a symbol of progress if you're still carrying that baggage." James was beginning to understand the magnitude of what she meant. It wasn't just about getting people to forgive him, it was about becoming the person he had always claimed to be. The pain of confronting his past was excruciating, but it was the only way forward. Redemption, he realized, wasn't a quick fix. It was a long, difficult road. But it was the only road worth taking. And for the first time in a long while, he was ready to walk it. James Lancaster knew that redemption was not a destination, it was a process, a long and arduous journey that could not be rushed. His public life, once built on the pillars of justice and equality, was now in ruins. The public shaming, the fallout from the recording, and the painful conversations with those he had hurt had left him with a heavy heart. But as the dust settled, he realized something crucial. It was up to him to decide whether this moment would define his legacy, or if he could use it to rebuild himself into something better. Taking a break from the spotlight was the first step. James retreated from the public eye, choosing silence over the cameras and the crowds that once cheered him on. He made the difficult decision to step away from his social media accounts, canceling all upcoming speaking engagements. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to breathe without the pressure of public expectations. Instead of posting a message of hope or launching into a new campaign, he turned inward. James spent the next few months in deep reflection and therapy. It wasn't just about fixing his public image anymore. The conversations with racial justice groups and the people he had harmed were part of a much deeper process, one that demanded personal honesty. In therapy, James confronted the uncomfortable truths about his upbringing, the prejudices he had carried, and the entitlement he had unknowingly clung to. He realized that his casual use of racial slurs wasn't an anomaly, it was a manifestation of deeper issues within himself. His own biases had been hidden in plain sight, tucked away in the corners of his mind and heart, only to be unleashed in moments of comfort and familiarity. The work was grueling. At times, James felt as though he was unraveling every part of the identity he had so carefully built over the years. But that was the point. He had to strip away the layers of self-righteousness and confront the person he had been, someone who was quick to point fingers at others but slow to examine his own flaws. The realization that he had perpetuated the same harmful systems he once railed against was not an easy pill to swallow. As time passed, James began to take tangible steps to rebuild the relationships he had broken. He reached out to racial justice organizations, offering more than just an apology. He offered his time, his energy, and his willingness to listen and learn. In conversations with those who had once called him an ally, he was met with mixed reactions. Some welcomed his attempts at redemption, while others were more skeptical. They had seen too many figures like him, people who used activism as a platform but fell short when the real work was required. James understood the skepticism. After all, actions spoke louder than words, and his words had already proven to be hollow in the past. He worked to regain the trust of those who had once believed in him, showing up consistently and doing the hard work of repairing the damage he had caused. The story didn't end with a perfect resolution. There was no grand return to the stage, no massive public applause. Redemption, James realized, wasn't something that could be earned overnight. But he didn't need the applause anymore. What mattered now was the quiet, daily work of change. It was in the moments of reflection, the hard conversations, and the acknowledgement of his flaws. And for the first time in a long while, James felt like he was on the right path. He wasn't the man he once was. But in the process of rebuilding himself, he began to see a version of himself that was more aligned with the values he had always preached. The road ahead was still long, and the scars of his past would always be there, but for James Lancaster, that was a burden he was finally willing to carry. His work wasn't done, it was only just beginning.